Sparrow had learned 3 things in her 3 years tending soldiers at the edge of every skirmish the Crown dragged her toward. How to stitch a wound by lantern light without flinching, how to sleep through the sound of distant clashing steel, and how to make watered-down broth taste like something a dying man might actually want to finish. She had not learned, apparently, how to mind her own business, which was how she found herself kneeling in the dark behind the grain sacks at midnight, facing down a wounded, heavily pregnant wolf who looked entirely prepared to take her hand off at the wrist. "You know," Sparrow said conversationally, not moving an inch closer. "Most creatures that bite the person trying to help them regret it eventually. Just something to consider." The wolf's growl didn't lessen, but it didn't sharpen either. More a tired warning than a real threat. The particular exhaustion of something that had been defending itself far longer than it had strength left for. "Corporal Fitch!" Sparrow hissed toward the tent flap, not taking her eyes off the wolf. "I need clean cloth. And quietly, unless you'd like the entire camp to know we've got a bleeding wolf the size of a small horse hiding in the grain stores." Fitch appeared a moment later, a broad, gray-whiskered veteran of more campaigns than he'd ever bothered counting, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and, by his own frequent insistence, most of his patience for anything that wasn't a proper cup of tea. He took one look at the wolf, one look at Sparrow, and sighed with the particular weariness of a man who had genuinely believed, after 30 years of service, that nothing could surprise him anymore. "That," he said, "is not a wolf, girl. That is a very large, very pregnant problem wearing fur." Astute. "I didn't survive 3 sieges to be eaten by royal livestock." "She's not livestock, Fitch. Look at her collar." Fitch squinted in the lantern light, and his weathered face did something complicated. Surprise, then alarm, then a kind of resigned dread that suggested he understood exactly what kind of trouble had just wandered into his evening. "That's the king's seal," he said slowly. "That's Aster, the king's own guarded wolf, the one nobody's meant to so much as look at without 3 guards and a formal request. Well, she's currently bleeding on our grain sacks, so I'd say the formal request window has closed." Fitch muttered something uncharitable under his breath about healers who never once considered the paperwork implications of their kindness, and went to fetch the cloth anyway, because for all his complaining, Sparrow had learned in 3 years that he always went and fetched the cloth anyway. Aster did not make it easy. Every time Sparrow's hands drew close to the wound at her shoulder, the wolf's lips curled back again, a low, warning rumble building deep in her chest, and twice Sparrow had to pull back entirely rather than risk a bite that would, she suspected, take considerably more than stitches to fix. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" Sparrow murmured, settling back on her heels, giving the wolf space rather than pushing further. "That's fair. I don't imagine being the crown's most valuable creature leaves much room for anyone touching you without wanting something from it." Aster's ears flicked, listening despite herself. "I don't want anything," Sparrow continued, keeping her voice low and even, the same tone she used on soldiers too far gone in fever to know friend from stranger. "Not your luck, not your favor, not whatever the priests say you're worth to the whole campaign. I just don't like watching things bleed out in a grain tent when I could do something about it." She didn't move closer. She simply kept talking, low and steady, filling the silence with nothing in particular, until slowly, reluctantly, the growl in Aster's chest eased into something closer to a tired, wary huff. "There," Sparrow said softly. "That's not trust yet, but I'll take not actively planning my death as a start." It took the better part of an hour, moving in inches, but eventually Aster allowed the cloth against her shoulder, allowed the gentle pressure of Sparrow's hands cleaning the wound, even as every muscle in her body remained coiled and ready to bolt. "Good," Sparrow murmured, working quickly now that the wolf had settled. "Good girl. Whoever hurt you, they're going to have considerably worse luck than you're having tonight. I promise you that." It was nearly dawn when Fitch returned with fresh water, and the particular expression of a man bearing news he didn't want to deliver. "Camp's talking," he said. Word spread that Aster's missing from the king's personal tent. There's a search underway. Quietly, so far, but it won't stay quiet long. How did she even get here? No idea. But I'd wager whoever's responsible for guarding the crown's most sacred creature is having a considerably worse night than either of us. Fitch crouched down, examining the now cleaned wound with a critical eye. That's a blade cut, not an animal bite. Somebody did this to her deliberately. Sparrow's stomach turned cold at that. Why would anyone want to hurt her? She's supposed to be untouchable. Untouchable things make excellent leverage, girl. Ask anyone who's spent time around a war council. Fitch's voice had gone grim in a way she rarely heard from him. If someone wanted to weaken the king's resolve, or force his hand in negotiations, hurting the one creature he's sworn his life to protect would do it faster than any blade at the front line ever could. Before Sparrow could fully absorb that, the tent flap tore open, and the man who filled the entrance made both of them go instantly, completely still. He was tall in the particular way that made low tent ceilings feel personally offended by his existence, dressed in armor that had clearly seen real use rather than ceremonial polish, and his eyes, when they landed on Aster, curled protectively beneath Sparrow's hands, went wide with a relief so total it looked almost like pain. Aster. His voice cracked on the name, all royal composure abandoned entirely. He was across the tent in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the wolf with none of the careful dignity Sparrow imagined a king was meant to maintain in front of strangers. Aster's tail thumped weakly against the ground, and something in the king's shoulders loosened just enough that Sparrow understood, watching him, exactly how much fear he'd been carrying since discovering her missing. "You found her," he said, looking up at Sparrow for the first time. And there was something raw and unguarded in his face that she suspected he rarely allowed anyone to see. "Who are you?" "Sparrow. Camp healer. 3rd tent from the supply stores." She kept her hands steady on Aster's shoulder despite the sudden weight of royal attention. "She was already here when I found her. Someone cut her before she made it this far, Your Majesty." Deliberately, from the look of the wound. Something dangerous moved behind the king's eyes at that. Not the wild grief he'd shown a moment ago, but something colder, more controlled, the particular fury of a man calculating exactly who might have had both the opportunity and the motive. "You're certain it was deliberate?" "I've stitched enough wounds to know the difference between an accident and intent, Your Majesty." This was intent. He was quiet a long moment, one hand resting gently on Aster's flank, checking the rise and fall of her breathing with the same careful attention Sparrow had used moments before. "Thank you," he said finally, and it came out rougher than she expected from a king, like the words cost him something to say plainly. "For not turning her away, for not reporting it up the chain before treating her first." She was bleeding. Reporting it could have waited. Most people would have reported it first anyway. Politics before people, in my experience. Something almost bitter crossed his expression, before he visibly set it aside. "I'm Roderick, though I suspect you already gathered that from the general commotion." "I gathered it from the armor, mostly," Sparrow said, and was faintly startled by her own boldness, though something in his exhausted, unguarded expression made bluntness feel safer than careful deference. Kings don't usually crawl through tent flaps at midnight for ordinary reasons. That earned her the ghost of a smile, brief, surprised, gone almost before it fully formed. "No," he agreed. "We generally don't." Fitch, who had been watching this entire exchange with the particular relish of a man storing up gossip for later, cleared his throat loudly. "Begging Your Majesty's pardon," he said. "But if someone deliberately hurt the crown's sacred wolf inside a supposedly secure camp, I'd wager whoever did it isn't finished trying." Roderick's jaw tightened. "You're right. She can't stay in the supply tents. It's the first place anyone would think to search, and clearly someone already did. She trusts Sparrow, Fitch offered, with the air of a man solving a problem mostly because solving problems was easier than standing around feeling useless. Took her the better part of an hour to let the girl near that wound, and Aster doesn't let anyone near anything most days, from what I hear. Roderick looked at Sparrow properly then, something calculating and careful moving behind his exhausted eyes. Would you be willing to keep watching over her, quietly, away from the main camp, until I can determine who did this and why? I'm a healer, not a bodyguard. You're the first person in months she's allowed to touch her without drawing blood in return, Roderick said simply. That's worth considerably more to me right now than any guard's blade. Sparrow glanced down at Aster, who had settled fully now, her great head resting against Sparrow's knee with an ease that surprised even Sparrow herself, and found she didn't have a ready argument against that particular logic. Fine, she said, but I want proper supplies, not whatever the quartermaster's been rationing us, and I want to know exactly who might have reason to hurt her, so I know what I'm actually watching for. Reasonable terms, Roderick said, something almost like relief in his voice. I contain considerably more reasonable terms where those came from, Sparrow said, and Fitch, behind them, made a small strangled sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh he was determined not to let fully escape in front of a king. Outside the tent, the first gray light of dawn was creeping over the camp, and somewhere beyond it, whoever had cut Aster's shoulder was still out there, watching, waiting to try again. Though none of them, in that quiet, exhausted tent, yet understood exactly how close and how personal that danger already was. The tent Roderick arranged for them by mid-morning was, by any fair account, an upgrade Sparrow hadn't asked for and wasn't entirely sure she wanted. Set apart from the main camp, guarded discreetly, and stocked with supplies that made Fitch whistle low through his teeth when he inventoried them. Real bandages, he said, holding up a roll like it was contraband. Actual willow bark, not the sawdust the quartermaster's been passing off as medicine. Girl, you've upgraded us considerably by nearly getting eaten by royal livestock. She didn't eat me. Give it time. You've known each other one full night. Aster, curled in the corner on a nest of blankets that some poor soldier had clearly been ordered to fetch at considerable personal inconvenience, let out a long-suffering sigh that suggested she found the entire conversation beneath her dignity. She understands you, you know, Sparrow said, settling beside the wolf to check the wound again. I'd be careful what you say about her. I've survived 30 years of campaigns, 3 commanding officers who wanted me flogged, and 1 memorably furious goat. I'm not afraid of a wolf with opinions. Aster's head turned slowly toward him, gold eyes fixing on Fitch with an unblinking, deeply unimpressed stare that made the old soldier take an involuntary step backward. On second thought, he said, I retract the goat comparison. Deeply unfair to the goat. Sparrow laughed despite herself, and something in Aster's posture eased slightly at the sound, as though the wolf had decided, cautiously, that a place where people laughed easily might be worth tolerating a little longer. By afternoon, word had reached the camp in the particular way rumors always did, faster than any official announcement, twisted just enough in the telling to be nearly unrecognizable by the time it reached the mess tent. Heard the king's pet wolf attacked 3 guards trying to steal her, one soldier was saying when Sparrow passed by for water, and some healer girl tamed her bare-handed. Heard it was an assassin from the Eastern Territories, another added. Snuck into camp disguised as a quartermaster. Sparrow kept walking, resisting the powerful urge to correct either version because she suspected the truth. A wolf hidden in grain sacks, cut by someone still unidentified, currently being nursed by the camp's lowest-ranked healer, would spread just as wildly regardless of what she said, and at least the current rumors made her sound marginally more competent than reality. She found Roderick near the War Council tent, deep in hushed argument with a broad-shouldered man, whose insignia marked him as a general, and something in the tension of that conversation made her slow her steps rather than interrupt. "Cannot simply pretend this didn't happen," the general was saying, voice low but sharp. "If word spreads that the crown's sacred creature can be attacked within our own camp, it undermines everything we've built this campaign on. Morale, the men's faith in your protection, all of it." "I'm aware of the stakes, Voss," Roderick said, tight and controlled. "I'm equally aware that announcing it publicly before I know who's responsible only tells whoever did this that their plan is working. Or it tells the men their king takes threats seriously and won't be cowed by cowardly attacks on defenseless creatures. She's not defenseless. She's pregnant and wounded and hiding, which is considerably different." Roderick's voice had gone hard in a way Sparrow hadn't heard from him yet. "I won't use her as a rallying speech, Voss. Not even for morale." General Voss's jaw tightened, something calculating flickering behind his eyes before he smoothed it into careful deference. "As you say, Your Majesty, I only want what's best for the campaign." He left without another word, and Sparrow, still hovering near the tent flap, found herself studying his retreating back with an unease she couldn't quite name. "You heard that," Roderick said, without turning around once Voss had gone. "Some of it. Enough." General Voss believes strongly in symbols. He's not wrong that Aster matters to the men's morale. He's simply willing to use that fact in ways I'm not comfortable with. Roderick rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion settling into every line of it. He's also, I should say, been an effective commander for years. Won us 3 engagements that would have gone badly under lesser leadership. I don't want to distrust him without cause. But you do. Distrust him? A little. A little, he admitted. Someone attacked Aster inside a secure camp. That requires access, timing, and knowledge of her usual guard rotation that very few people possess. Voss possesses all 3. So does anyone on his staff, or yours for that matter. An uncomfortably fair point. He looked at her properly then, something rueful crossing his exhausted face. You're remarkably difficult to have a private, brooding moment of suspicion around. You keep interrupting it with reasonable counter-arguments. "I contain multitudes," Sparrow said, and was rewarded with that same brief, surprised almost smile from the night before. That evening, Fitch produced, from some mysterious reserve of supplies he refused to explain, a proper meal, actual meat rather than the thin gruel most of camp survived on, and a bottle of something he insisted was medicinal, despite the label suggesting otherwise. "Where did this come from?" Sparrow asked, deeply suspicious. "A gentleman doesn't reveal his sources." "You're not a gentleman, Fitch. You're a cranky old soldier who once threatened to feed a supply officer to a goat." The goat again. "I see we're revisiting old grievances." Fitch poured a generous measure into a battered cup and pushed it toward her. "Drink. You've spent all day tending a wolf who could remove your hand with minimal effort, and a king who apparently can't be bothered to sleep properly. You've earned it." Sparrow accepted, mostly to avoid further argument, and found the drink considerably stronger than she expected, warmth spreading through her chest as Aster shifted beside her, resting her great head across Sparrow's lap with a contented sigh that suggested the wolf at least approved of the evening's proceedings. "She likes you," Fitch observed, watching this with open interest. "Genuinely likes you, not just tolerates you the way she tolerates the rest of us poor souls assigned to her care. She's had a rough few days. Anyone kind probably seems appealing right now." "That's not it, and you know it isn't." Fitch's teasing gentled into something more sincere. "I've watched that wolf snarl at physicians, generals, and one particularly unfortunate priest who tried to bless her without permission. She's decided you're safe. That's not nothing, girl." Sparrow ran a hand along Aster's ear, feeling the wolf lean into the touch with obvious trust, and found something warm settling in her chest that she wasn't quite ready to examine closely. Roderick joined them later, slipping into the tent with the particular careful quiet of a man trying not to disturb a peace he suspected was fragile. I'm interrupting, he said, seeing the state of things. Fitch's mysterious bottle. Aster sprawled comfortably. Sparrow relaxed in a way she rarely allowed herself around anyone of rank. You're interrupting a very serious discussion about goats, Fitch said solemnly. Feel free to weigh in, Your Majesty. We value all perspectives on the matter. I have strong opinions about goats, Roderick said, settling onto an overturned crate with the ease of a man who'd clearly spent considerable time in far less comfortable camp seating over the years. None of them are printable in polite company. This is not polite company, Sparrow said. This is a supply tent with a pregnant wolf and a man who threatened to feed someone to livestock. Then I feel free to elaborate at length. He did, and Sparrow found herself laughing properly for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. A real laugh, unguarded. Startled out of her by a king's surprisingly detailed and deeply personal grievances against a specific goat from his childhood that had, by his account, ruined an entire diplomatic garden and several important flower beds out of pure spite. Fitch, watching this exchange with the keen satisfaction of a man who considered himself entirely responsible for the evening's success, refilled everyone's cups and said nothing at all, though the look he exchanged with Aster suggested both of them had reached some private, mutual conclusion about the evening's proceedings. It was Fitch, 3 days later, who noticed the detail that changed everything. This blade cut, he said, examining Aster's healing wound with the critical eye of a man who'd seen more battlefield injuries than he cared to count, isn't a soldier's blade. Look at the angle, the depth. That's a ceremonial dagger, girl. The kind carried by officers, not frontline men. Sparrow leaned closer, studying the now mostly healed wound with fresh attention. You're certain? Certain as I can be without the actual weapon in front of me. Soldiers carry practical blades, meant for practical killing. This was made by someone who wanted the cut clean, not necessarily fatal. Like they were trying to weaken her, not kill her outright. The implications settled slowly, cold and unwelcome. Someone wanted her hurt specifically, not dead, hurt enough to matter, but not enough to end her. That's my read on it, yes. Sparrow thought of General Voss's careful, controlled argument in the war tent, the men's faith in your protection, and felt something uneasy tighten in her chest. If someone wanted to demonstrate that the Crown's protection has limits, she said slowly, hurting Aster without killing her would do exactly that. A public wound, a visible weakness. Something to point to. That's a considerably darker read on our general than I was prepared to have before breakfast. I didn't say it was Voss specifically. I said the wound suggests someone with that particular goal in mind. Fitch was quiet a moment, turning that over with more seriousness than his usual gruff humor allowed. Careful who you say that to, girl. Accusing a general of treason without solid proof is the kind of thing that ends healers' careers rather abruptly, whatever the truth of it. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm noticing a pattern and mentioning it to the one person who has the authority to actually investigate it properly. Roderick's reaction, when she brought him the observation that evening, was more measured than she expected. Not the immediate fury she'd half anticipated, but a careful, weary consideration that suggested he'd already turned these same suspicions over privately more than once. A ceremonial dagger, he repeated slowly. That narrows things considerably. Common soldiers wouldn't have access to one. Officers would. Voss carries one. I noticed it at his belt the day I overheard your argument. So do a dozen other officers in this camp, myself included. He said it fairly, without deflecting the implication entirely. I won't accuse a man who's served this crown loyally for 15 years based on a blade type alone, Sparrow. That's not justice. That's convenience dressed up as suspicion. I'm not asking you to accuse him. I'm asking you to watch him more carefully than you have been. I've been watching him since the moment Aster went missing. Something tired and honest crossed Roderick's face. I want to be wrong about him. He's been a genuinely effective commander. Loyal, by every visible measure, for over a decade. If he's the one behind this, it means I've badly misjudged a man I trusted with real authority, and that failure sits on me as much as on him. Sparrow studied him a long moment, something in his weary honesty settling differently than she expected. You're not looking for someone to blame easily. You're actually trying to find the truth, even if it's inconvenient. I've watched too many rulers reach for the convenient villain rather than the true one. I'd rather be slow and correct than fast and wrong, whatever it costs me in appearing decisive. That's rare for a king. So I'm told frequently by advisors who'd prefer I move faster and think less. A small, tired smile. I find I don't much care for their version of leadership. That night, unable to sleep, Sparrow found herself sitting beside Aster in the quiet dark, one hand resting against the wolf's now considerably rounder belly, feeling the occasional flutter of movement beneath her palm. "You're getting close, aren't you?" she murmured. "Whatever's coming, pups included. We'll figure it out before then. I promise you that much." Aster's tail thumped once against the blankets, and her gold eyes, half-lidded with sleepy contentment, fixed on Sparrow with something that looked, unmistakably, like trust. It was Roderick who found her there an hour later, having apparently given up on sleep himself, settling quietly beside her without asking permission, the way he'd started doing more frequently these past few days. "She trusts you completely now," he observed quietly. "It took me over a year to earn half that trust when she first came into my care. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't ask her for anything. That's rarer than you'd think, in my experience. Most people, given access to something as valuable as her, want something from it eventually. A favor, an alliance, a symbol to point to." He glanced at her, something unguarded in his tired expression. "You've asked for nothing this entire time. Not favor, not advancement, not even proper credit for saving her life that first night. I'm not doing this for credit. I know, that's precisely what makes it remarkable." He was quiet a moment, watching Aster's peaceful, sleeping breaths. "I find myself wondering lately what exactly you do want. If not favor or advancement, what is it you're actually after, staying up all these nights in a supply tent with a wolf and a cranky old soldier?" Sparrow considered the question longer than she meant to, surprised by how difficult it was to answer plainly. "I don't know entirely," she admitted finally. "I think I just wanted, for once, to matter to something without having to fight for the privilege of being noticed first." Something in Roderick's face shifted at that. Recognition, maybe, or the particular ache of hearing your own private fear spoken aloud by someone else entirely. "You already do," he said quietly. "Matter, I mean. Considerably more than you seem to realize." Neither of them said anything further, the silence stretching comfortable and warm between them, broken only by Aster's slow, contented breathing and the distant, ordinary sounds of a camp settling into another uneasy night. Unaware, for now, of how much closer General Voss's careful plans had already crept toward the surface, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike again. The attack came on a night thick with fog, the kind that swallowed torchlight within a few feet and made every shadow in camp seem to shift with unfamiliar intent. Sparrow woke to Aster's low, warning growl, the wolf already on her feet despite her heavy belly, hackles raised, gold eyes fixed on the tent flap with an intensity that had Sparrow reaching for the small blade she'd started keeping under her bedroll since the first attack. "Fitch!" she hissed. But the old soldier was already awake, already moving, sword drawn with the swift, unthinking competence of 30 years of instinct. The flap tore open, and for one terrible second, Sparrow saw only a shape, cloaked, hooded, moving with purpose rather than confusion. Before Aster lunged, faster than her pregnant weight should have allowed, teeth closing hard around the intruder's forearm, a muffled cry of pain, a scuffle, and then Fitch was there, blade at the intruder's throat, and the fight ended almost as quickly as it began. "Guards!" Fitch bellowed, loud enough to wake half the camp. "Guards! Now!" By the time Roderick arrived, breathless and half-dressed, the intruder had been subdued and disarmed, hood torn back to reveal a face Sparrow didn't recognize. Young, frightened, clearly not a trained assassin so much as someone in far over his depth. "Who sent you?" Roderick demanded, voice carrying the particular cold authority Sparrow hadn't heard from him before. The young man's eyes darted between the king, the wolf still bristling protectively in front of Sparrow, and the blade at his own throat, and something in his expression crumpled entirely. "I didn't want to," he said, voice shaking. "I swear it, Your Majesty. My sister, she's ill, needs medicine we can't afford, and someone offered enough coin to cover it twice over if I just weakened the wolf's guard rotation, reported her movements. I never meant for anyone to actually hurt her tonight. I was only meant to report, not to—" "Who paid you?" Roderick cut in, sharper now. "I don't know his name. He wore a hood the whole time we spoke, arranged everything through a go-between. But he had the bearing of an officer, Your Majesty. Educated speech. A ring on his hand, gold, with a crest I didn't recognize." Sparrow's stomach turned cold. Voss wore exactly such a ring. She'd noticed it herself, weeks ago, glinting during his tense conversation with Roderick outside the war tent. "That's not proof," Roderick said quietly, seemingly reading the thought on her face. "Rings like that aren't unique to one man, but it's a thread worth pulling." The young man, whose name, it emerged under gentler questioning, was Elias, was taken into custody rather than executed on the spot, a mercy that visibly surprised him and drew a raised eyebrow from Fitch. "Softer than most kings I've served under," Fitch observed once Elias had been led away. "He's a frightened boy who made a desperate choice for a sick sister, not a hardened enemy of the crown," Roderick said. "I want the man who paid him. Punishing a coerced messenger accomplishes nothing except making myself feel briefly powerful. Sensible policy, rare though. So I'm frequently told." Roderick's jaw was tight, exhaustion and fury warring plainly across his face. Whoever's behind this grows bolder. First a blade in the dark, weeks of careful silence, now a paid intruder willing to risk capture. That's not the behavior of someone content to wait quietly. Sparrow, kneeling beside Aster to check the wolf for injury, found her hands unsteady in a way she didn't like. She could have been killed tonight. She wasn't. Roderick knelt beside them both, one hand resting gently on Aster's flank, checking the same way Sparrow just had. "Because you were here. Because she trusted you enough to wake at the first hint of danger and fight rather than flee." "That's not enough. Not if they keep trying." "No," he agreed grimly. "It isn't. Which means we need to end this properly, not simply survive it night after night waiting for the next attempt." It was Fitch, unexpectedly, who provided the plan that evening over a considerably less cheerful bottle of his mysterious reserve. "You want to draw him out," he said. "You need bait he can't resist. Something that looks like an opportunity too good to pass up." "I'm not using Aster as bait," Roderick said immediately, sharp and protective. "Didn't say her specifically?" Fitch's weathered face had gone thoughtful in a way that suggested genuine tactical experience beneath the usual gruff humor. "Spread word that she's being moved to a more secure location 3 nights from now, along a specific route. If whoever's behind this wants another chance, that's exactly the kind of opportunity they can't resist trying for. Then you have guards waiting along that route instead of her actually being there." "That could work," Sparrow said slowly. "But it requires trusting that word actually reaches the right person without alerting everyone else in camp." "Which means," Roderick said, understanding settling grimly into his expression, "we tell only a small handful of officers the false route. Whoever it reaches, and whoever shows up that night, narrows things considerably." "You're suggesting we test Voss specifically?" I'm suggesting we test everyone with access to that information, Roderick said carefully. If it happens to clear him entirely, I'll be relieved. If it doesn't... He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. The plan required patience neither Sparrow nor Roderick particularly possessed, and the 3 days leading up to it stretched taut with a tension that made even Fitch's usual jokes feel strained around the edges. "You're not sleeping," Roderick observed, finding Sparrow awake again well past midnight on the second night. Aster curled heavily against her side. "Neither are you." "Fair point." He settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I keep thinking about what happens if this doesn't work. If whoever's behind this simply waits us out, tries again some other way we haven't anticipated. Then we adapt, same as we have been." You say that so plainly, like it's simple. It's not simple. It's just the only option that doesn't involve giving up, so I don't see much value in dwelling on the alternative. Sparrow glanced at him, something warm and unguarded in the tired lantern light. "You've been carrying this alone a long time, haven't you? Long before I ever found her bleeding in that grain tent. Since I was young enough that carrying things alone simply became habit rather than choice." He was quiet a moment, watching Aster's peaceful, sleeping breaths. "She's the last true piece of my mother I have left. My mother raised her line herself, believed the land only stayed kind to people who were kind to it first. When she died, Aster was barely more than a pup, and I promised I'd keep the bloodline safe no matter what it cost me. That's not just duty, is it? It's grief. Both, tangled together so thoroughly I've stopped trying to separate them." He looked at her then, something raw in his exhausted expression. "You've never once asked me to be less than honest about that. Everyone else in my life wants the composed version, the version that reassures them the crown is steady and unshaken. You just let me be tired. I don't have much use for composed versions of people. I've spent too many years stitching up men who spent their last moments pretending they weren't afraid, when honesty would have served them so much better in the time they had left." Something shifted in his expression at that. Not quite a smile, but close to it, tired and genuine. "You're a remarkably blunt woman for someone the crown ranks as its lowest healer." "I contain multitudes," Sparrow said, and this time his laugh was real, warm, entirely unguarded, and it stayed with her long after he'd finally gone to find what little sleep remained before dawn. The false route led along the eastern tree line, a stretch of forest chosen specifically for its cover, and by the third night, Roderick had a dozen hand-picked guards concealed among the trees, waiting in tense, silent readiness. Sparrow remained behind with Aster, safely tucked in the supply tent, though the waiting proved nearly unbearable in its own particular way. Every distant sound making her flinch, every long silence stretching her nerves thinner. "They'll be all right," Fitch said, more gently than his usual gruffness allowed, settling beside her with a cup of something considerably weaker than his usual reserve, clearly recognizing the night called for steadiness rather than levity. Roderick's led men through worse than a forest ambush. He knows what he's doing. That doesn't make the waiting easier. "No," Fitch agreed. "It rarely does." Aster, sensing the tension despite her own confinement, paced the length of the tent in restless circles, belly swaying heavily, occasionally letting out a low, worried whine that made Sparrow's chest ache with matching unease. "I know," Sparrow murmured, kneeling to press her forehead against the wolf's. "I don't like it either. But we did everything we could. Now we wait." Word came just before dawn, carried by a breathless young guard whose face told the story before he'd said a single word. "We caught someone," he reported, still catching his breath. Moving along the false route exactly as planned, officer's bearing, ceremonial dagger at his belt matching the description from the first attack. "He's being brought to the command tent now. Your Majesty wants you both there." Sparrow's heart pounded the entire walk to the command tent, dread and hope tangled together in equal measure, and what she found there stopped her cold. It was not General Voss. It was his second in command, a younger officer named Captain Ellard Marsh, disheveled and furious, restrained between two guards, his face contorted with the particular panic of a man watching his careful plans collapse entirely. "Captain Marsh," Roderick said, voice carrying cold and controlled fury across the tent, "I confess I expected someone else entirely." "You'll find no proof connecting me to anything," Marsh spat, though the tremor in his voice suggested less confidence than his words claimed. "We found this on him," one of the guards said, holding up a familiar gold ring bearing a distinctive crest. A raven, wings spread, clutched in silver. Sparrow's breath caught. Not Voss's ring at all, though similar enough in style to have created the assumption. A different crest entirely, one she now recognized from documents she'd seen passed between officers weeks ago. "That's the seal of House Marsh," Roderick said slowly, understanding settling grim and cold across his face. "Your own family's crest, Captain. Not General Voss's at all." Marsh's composure finally cracked entirely. "My family lost everything when the Crown redistributed the Northern Territories 3 years ago. Land that had been ours for 4 generations, given instead to families who'd shown more recent loyalty. I believed that if the Crown's precious luck-bearer suffered publicly, if people began questioning whether the Crown's protection truly extended everywhere it claimed to, there might be room to renegotiate old grievances. A weakened Crown listens more carefully to old complaints." "You'd have heard a pregnant, defenseless creature," Roderick said, voice low and dangerous. "Over land redistributed 3 years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with her at all." "I never meant to kill her," Marsh said. And there was something genuinely wretched in his voice now. The collapse of a man who'd convinced himself, over months of quiet grievance, that his plan was justice rather than cruelty. Only to weaken her, prove a point. "I told myself repeatedly it was about the land, about my family's honor, never really about her at all, as though that distinction made any of it acceptable." Sparrow felt something complicated move through her, watching him. Not sympathy exactly, but the same uneasy recognition she'd felt once about Elias, the frightened messenger. A man who'd convinced himself his cruelty served a larger, nobler grievance, only to find, too late, that cruelty rarely stayed contained to the boundaries you first drew for it. "You'll answer for this before the full council," Roderick said. "All of it. The wound, the attempted second attack, the coercion of an innocent boy with a sick sister. Whatever grievance your family carries about the Northern Territories, I'll hear it properly, through proper channels, once this matter is fully settled. But you don't get to hurt what I've sworn to protect and call it justice." Marsh said nothing further, led away under guard, and the tent settled into a heavy, exhausted silence once he'd gone. "You look relieved," Sparrow observed, watching Roderick's shoulders finally loosen from weeks of carried tension. "I am, genuinely." He glanced at her, something warm breaking through the exhaustion. "Not because it wasn't Voss, though I confess that particular relief runs deep, given how much I'd have hated being right about a man I trusted for years. Mostly because it's finally over. She's safe now, properly, not just for tonight." Aster, sensing the shift in mood, pressed her great head against Roderick's leg with a contented sigh, tail thumping steadily against the ground. "She agrees," Sparrow said, smiling despite the exhaustion of the long night. "She usually does, about most things that matter." Roderick reached down, scratching gently behind the wolf's ears, and then looked back at Sparrow with something more serious settling into his expression. "I owe you considerably more than simple thanks for all of this. For staying, for trusting the plan, for 3 weeks of watching over her when you had every reasonable excuse to simply report the danger and let someone else handle the risk. I don't do things for owed debts, Your Majesty." "Roderick," he corrected gently, the way he'd started doing more frequently these past weeks. "And I know that. It's precisely why I find myself wanting to give you something anyway, entirely separate from any debt." Something in his tone made her breath catch, the tent suddenly feeling smaller than it had a moment before. And outside, the first proper light of dawn broke clean and gold across a camp finally, fully at peace for the first time in weeks. The camp, in the days following Captain Marsh's arrest, settled into something Sparrow hadn't realized she'd been missing. An ordinary, unremarkable quiet, the particular peace of a place no longer holding its breath. "You're smiling," Fitch observed one morning, watching her change Astor's now nearly healed bandage with considerably less caution than the task had required weeks earlier. "It's disorienting. I preferred your usual scowl of professional competence. I can still scowl if it would make you more comfortable. Please don't trouble yourself on my account." Fitch settled onto an overturned crate with his customary cup of something suspicious, watching Astor stretch out fully in a patch of morning sun, with the particular satisfaction of a creature who'd finally stopped needing to sleep with one eye open. "She looks better than I've seen her since that first bloody night." "She is better. Physically, anyway." Sparrow ran a gentle hand along the wolf's swollen belly, feeling the occasional flutter of movement beneath her palm. "Marin, the healer who trained me back before the campaign, used to say a creature heals twice as fast once it stops expecting the next attack. I think that's exactly what's happening here. Poetic, for a woman who spends her mornings elbow-deep in wolf, examining wounds. I contain multitudes, Fitch. We've established this." "You have indeed. Repeatedly. I'm keeping a formal tally." He took a long sip of his questionable brew, watching her with an expression that had gone, beneath its usual gruffness, unexpectedly fond. "The king's been considerably less broody lately, too, in case you hadn't noticed. Practically cheerful by his usual standards. It's a remarkable transformation for a man I've watched carry the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders since he was barely more than a boy." "I've noticed. Have you also noticed that you're the reason for it?" Sparrow didn't have a ready answer for that, and Fitch, with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd successfully landed a point he'd been quietly building toward for weeks, said nothing further, simply sipped his drink and let the silence do its own work. Roderick found her later that same afternoon, seated beside Astor in a patch of shade, mending a torn strap on the wolf's blanket, with the careful, methodical stitches of someone who'd learned needlework out of necessity rather than leisure. "You've a hidden talent," he observed, settling beside her. "Not hidden. Just never useful enough for anyone to comment on before now. I find that difficult to believe, given how thoroughly you've upended my entire camp's sense of order in a matter of weeks." He said it lightly, but there was real warmth underneath. "I received word this morning. The Northern Territory's dispute, Marsh's family grievance, has been formally referred to proper arbitration. It seems, whatever his methods, there was some legitimate injustice buried underneath his cruelty. Land redistributed hastily, without proper compensation, 3 years ago. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, it doesn't. But I've decided it's worth examining honestly, rather than dismissing entirely simply because the man who raised it went about it in the worst possible way." Roderick's expression had gone thoughtful, the particular weight of a ruler genuinely wrestling with competing truths rather than simply choosing the convenient one. "I find myself wanting to be the kind of king who can hold both things at once, that a man committed real wrongdoing, and that the grievance underneath it deserved better than it received the first time. That's considerably more nuanced than most rulers bother with. Most rulers haven't had a blunt, remarkably persuasive healer pointing out repeatedly that people are rarely simply villains or simply victims." He glanced at her, something warm and unguarded in his tired eyes. "You've changed how I think about a great many things these past weeks. Not just about Marsh or Voss or the campaign generally, about what kind of ruler I actually want to be, rather than the one I inherited by default." Sparrow felt her breath catch slightly at that, setting down her needlework to properly meet his gaze. That's a lot of weight to put on a camp healer with questionable needlework skills. Your needlework is perfectly competent. I simply enjoy teasing you about it. His hand found hers, careful and questioning, the same gesture he'd offered once before and let linger unanswered. Sparrow, I want to be plain with you, the way you've been plain with me since the very first night. I've come to care for you considerably more than simple gratitude accounts for. That's a dangerous thing for a king to admit. I've found myself choosing danger rather more frequently lately. It seems to be a developing pattern. A small, wry smile that didn't fully hide the sincerity beneath it. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. I only wanted it said plainly, rather than left unspoken between us indefinitely. Sparrow studied him a long moment. This man who'd run cloakless through a foggy camp for a wounded wolf, who'd chosen slow and correct over fast and convenient even when it cost him politically, who teased about goats and meant every honest word underneath the humor, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she'd been waiting for exactly this admission longer than she'd let herself acknowledge. I care for you too, she said finally. Considerably more than I planned to, given that we met with you covered in mud and me elbow-deep in your wolf's shoulder wound. That's possibly the least romantic origin story in the history of the crown. I contain multitudes. Apparently that extends to inconveniently timed romances as well. His laugh when it came was warm and unguarded, and when he leaned in to kiss her, gentle, questioning, entirely without the practiced polish of court romance, Aster let out a long, satisfied sigh from her spot in the shade, as though she'd been waiting the entire afternoon for exactly this outcome and had simply been exercising extraordinary patience about it. She approves, Roderick said, laughing against her mouth as they broke apart. She approves of anyone who feeds her extra rations. I wouldn't read too much into it. I choose to read everything into it. It suits my current mood. He rested his forehead against hers, something settled and peaceful in the gesture that hadn't been there in all the weeks of careful tension before. I want you to stay, Sparrow. Not just until Aster's pups are born. Though I want that too. I want you to stay properly, as part of this life, whatever shape that ends up taking. That's a considerable commitment for someone still elbow-deep in wolf wound care most mornings. I find the wolf wound care rather appealing, actually. Unconventional, but appealing. He pulled back slightly, serious now beneath the teasing. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I only wanted you to know the shape of what I'm hoping for, so you're not caught by surprise later. Sparrow felt something warm and terrifying settle in her chest, old caution warring with a hope she hadn't let herself fully feel in longer than she could remember. I'll think about it properly. That's all I can promise right now. That's more than enough, Roderick said, and meant it, pressing one more gentle kiss to her forehead before Fitch's deliberately loud throat clearing from the tent entrance announced that their private moment had officially concluded for the day. It was General Voss himself who requested a private audience with Sparrow 3 days later, an request that made Fitch go uncharacteristically quiet with concern. You don't have to agree to that, he said, watching her prepare to leave the supply tent. Man's still under suspicion in half the camp's eyes, whatever the evidence pointed to eventually. He's been formally cleared. Roderick trusts him again, mostly. Mostly isn't fully, and I'd rather you not test the difference alone. Sparrow appreciated the concern, but went anyway, curious despite herself about what the general might want, and found him waiting in a small private corner of the officers' quarters, looking considerably more tired and considerably less imposing than she remembered from the tense war council argument weeks earlier. Thank you for coming, Voss said, gesturing for her to sit. I imagine my invitation was met with some suspicion, given recent events. Fitch had opinions about it, yes. Fitch generally has opinions about everything. I've learned to expect it after years of shared campaigns. A ghost of a tired smile, gone quickly. I wanted to speak with you directly because I owe you an apology I haven't yet had proper opportunity to offer. My argument with the king, the one you overheard weeks ago about using Astor's situation for morale, I understand in hindsight how that must have sounded. How it likely contributed to suspicion falling on me once Marsh's plot was uncovered. It did contribute somewhat. I don't blame you for it. I've built my career on being the officer willing to make hard, uncomfortable arguments others avoid. That reputation serves the Crown well in most circumstances. It serves rather poorly when someone else's genuine crime happens to resemble, on the surface, the kind of cold calculation I've spent years being known for. He studied her carefully. I want you to know plainly that whatever my faults, and I have many, I won't pretend otherwise, I would never have harmed that creature, or anyone innocent, to make a political point. I argued for using her situation publicly because I genuinely believed transparency would serve the men's morale better than secrecy. I was wrong about the timing, perhaps. I was never wrong in my own conscience about the method. Sparrow studied him a long moment, remembering her own uneasy suspicion weeks earlier, the way his careful, ambitious argument had seemed, in the moment, dangerously close to villainy. I believe you, she said finally. For what it's worth, I was wrong to suspect you as thoroughly as I did. You weren't entirely wrong to suspect ambition in me. I do want things, advancement, recognition, a legacy that outlasts this particular campaign. I've simply never wanted them badly enough to hurt someone innocent in pursuit of them. That's a distinction I'd like to think matters, even if it wasn't obvious from the outside. It matters, Sparrow agreed. Most people aren't entirely one thing or the other. Ambitious and honorable can exist in the same person, same as cowardly and desperate can exist in the same person, the way it did with poor Elias, or grieving and vengeful both, the way it clearly did with Marsh. That's a remarkably generous way of viewing people, for someone who's spent years stitching up the damage they do to each other. Maybe that's exactly why I see it that way. I've watched enough dying men confess their genuine regrets to know that very few people believe themselves the villain of their own story, whatever damage they've actually caused. Voss was quiet a long moment, something thoughtful and slightly humbled in his expression. The king is fortunate, having someone in his circle willing to think that clearly under pressure. I hope you'll forgive an old soldier's bluntness in saying so directly. I'll allow it, this once. That earned an actual, genuine laugh from him. Brief, surprised, the first real warmth she'd seen from the general in all their tense encounters. I can see now why Fitch speaks of you with such stubborn fondness. Apologies again for the suspicion my own arguments caused. I hope we can move forward more easily now that the truth's fully settled. She relayed the conversation to Roderick that evening, watching something ease in his shoulders at the news. I'm relieved, he admitted. Genuinely. I'd hoped it wasn't him, but hope and certainty are different things, and I've spent weeks not entirely trusting my own judgment on the matter. He seems like a complicated man. Ambitious, occasionally cold in his arguments, but not cruel underneath it. That's precisely the kind of officer worth keeping close, honestly. The dangerous ones are rarely the ones who argue uncomfortable positions openly. They're the ones who smile pleasantly while quietly building their own advantage in the shadows, the way Marsh did for months before anyone noticed. Astor, sensing the lightened mood, rose slowly from her resting spot and made her way over to press her great head against Roderick's knee, tail thumping steadily. She's close now, Sparrow said, watching the wolf settle with visible effort, her belly rounder than Sparrow had ever seen it. Marin would say days if her old teachings about wolf gestation held true here as well. Days, Roderick repeated, something soft and disbelieving crossing his face. After everything, the wound, the attacks, all of it, she's finally close to actually delivering them safely. She is, and so are we, in our own way. Sparrow reached over, taking his hand properly this time, without hesitation. Whatever comes next, pups included. I think I'd like to be here for it. All of it. Properly, the way you asked. Roderick's answering smile, unguarded and entirely genuine, told her more clearly than any words could have exactly how much that answer meant to him. And outside the tent, the evening settled into a peace that felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely uncomplicated by danger, leaving only the quiet, anxious wait for new life to finally, safely arrive. The days that followed Voss's apology settled into something almost unfamiliar in its ease. No hidden threats, no ceremonial daggers, no careful political calculations disguised as concern for morale. "I don't trust it," Fitch admitted one morning, watching Aster waddle her considerable bulk toward a sunny patch near the tent entrance, with the particular slow dignity of a creature who had entirely given up on grace in favor of comfort. "Peace, I mean, feels suspicious after everything. You could try enjoying it instead of interrogating it. I've survived 30 years of campaigns by never trusting quiet mornings. Old habits." He settled onto his usual crate, watching the wolf circle twice before flopping down with a heavy, contented sigh. "Though I'll admit, she looks considerably more at peace than I've seen her since I first laid eyes on her, bleeding in that grain tent. She's earned the peace. So have we, honestly." Roderick joined them a short while later, dropping a stack of formal-looking documents onto the crate beside Fitch with visible relief. Marsh's formal hearing concluded this morning. He's been stripped of rank and title, sentenced to labor in the Northern Territories he claimed to be fighting for. Considerably more useful, I decided, than simple imprisonment. He'll spend the coming years actually rebuilding what his family lost, under proper supervision, rather than simply rotting in a cell resenting the crown further. "That's remarkably practical for a punishment," Sparrow said. "I've decided I'm tired of punishments that satisfy anger without actually fixing anything. Elias, the young messenger, has been pardoned entirely, provided he agrees to proper employment in the healer's corps. I understand his sister's illness requires the kind of medicine our own healers can now provide directly, without further desperate bargains with strangers in hoods." "You're building quite the reputation for uncomfortable mercy," Fitch observed. "I'd rather have that reputation than the alternative." Roderick settled beside Sparrow, watching Aster doze contentedly in the sun. "General Voss has also formally requested a transfer to advisory duties once this campaign concludes. Says he's grown tired of frontline command, wants time to actually see his own children grow rather than missing years of it for glory that mattered less than he once believed. People change, given the right circumstances," Sparrow said. "Or at least, they reveal parts of themselves that were always there, underneath the versions everyone assumed of them. You'd know that better than most of us, I think. You've spent this entire campaign refusing to assume the worst of anyone before actually looking closely. Someone has to. Otherwise, everyone just keeps mistaking each other for simpler villains than they actually are." That evening, word arrived that the campaign itself was drawing to its formal close. The Eastern Territories' dispute finally settled through proper negotiation rather than continued conflict. Terms agreed upon that satisfied, if not everyone fully, at least enough parties to end the fighting honorably. "We're going home," Roderick said, reading the formal dispatch with visible relief. "Properly this time. Not just retreating to regroup for another engagement. Home, meaning the castle," Sparrow said, "which I've never actually seen, come to think of it. You'll find it considerably less muddy than a supply tent, at minimum, though I confess the tent's had its own particular charms these past weeks." He reached for her hand, something warm and certain in the gesture. "I meant what I said before, about wanting you there properly. Not as a healer assigned to Aster's care, though that arrangement can certainly continue if you'd like it to. As something more than that. You're proposing something in your roundabout way? I'm working up to it, slowly. I've discovered I prefer building toward things properly rather than rushing them, given how badly rushed decisions tend to go for kings in matters of the heart." Sparrow laughed, warm and genuine, and found she didn't have a single argument ready against the particular hope settling in her chest. "Take your time, then. I find I'm not in any hurry either." That night, packing what few belongings she'd accumulated over the campaign, Sparrow found Fitch lingering in the tent entrance with an expression she rarely saw on him, something almost sentimental, quickly hidden behind his usual gruffness. "You'll still need a proper healer once we reach the castle," she said, folding a blanket with more attention than the task required. "Somewhere considerably grander than these accommodations, I imagine." "Already spoke to His Majesty about it," Fitch admitted. "Requested a permanent post in the castle's healing wing, assuming you'll still be needing an insufferable old soldier underfoot, offering unsolicited opinions about goats." "I'd be lost without your opinions about goats, honestly." "Damn right you would." He cleared his throat, something briefly unsteady in his weathered voice. "Proud of you, girl. Whatever comes next, you did good work these past weeks, and not just with the wolf." Sparrow felt her own throat tighten unexpectedly at that, and simply nodded, unable to trust her voice fully in that particular moment, though Fitch, with rare tact, chose not to comment further on it. The castle of Windmere did not so much appear as accumulate, tower by gray stone tower, the closer their small procession drew toward it, until Sparrow found herself craning her neck at an angle that made her feel personally insulted by architecture. "It's a lot of building," she said. "My grandfather added considerable excess purely to make a point to a neighboring house that no longer exists," Roderick said. "We don't discuss the details at dinner. Suffice to say the point was made, though not particularly well." Aster trotted ahead of the horses for most of the journey, belly swaying with the unhurried confidence of a creature who considered herself entirely in charge of the procession's pace, occasionally circling back to headbutt Roderick's leg when she felt the group was moving too slowly for her considerable comfort. By the time they crossed beneath the front gate, a broad, energetic woman moving with brisk, no-nonsense authority came striding across the courtyard, took one look at Aster's considerable girth, and made a sound of pure, delighted alarm. "Della," Roderick said, dismounting. "This is Sparrow. She's the reason Aster's survived this entire campaign with her litter intact, and considerably more besides." Della's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline, taking in Sparrow's travel-worn appearance with open, rapid assessment, before softening entirely into warmth. "Well, thank the old graces for that. Someone with sense, finally." She was already steering both of them toward the entrance with the easy authority of a woman who'd clearly been managing this particular household for decades. "Let's get this wolf somewhere soft before she has those pups in my courtyard out of pure spite for the journey." "She's been threatening exactly that for 2 days," Sparrow said, following. "She's earned the right to threaten whatever she likes. Carrying that much weight this far. Come on, love. I've had a den prepared for weeks on nothing but hopeful rumor." The den, when they reached it, was considerably more comfortable than anything the campaign had offered. Soft blankets layered thick, a small fire kept carefully low, windows positioned to let in gentle afternoon light without draft. Aster inspected it with the critical thoroughness of a queen assessing new quarters, circled twice, and finally collapsed into the blankets with a groan of profound relief that made everyone in the room laugh, despite the lingering exhaustion of travel. "She approves," Roderick said. "She'd approve of a mud puddle at this point, honestly," Sparrow said, kneeling to check the wolf over with practiced hands. "She's close now, Della. Days, maybe less." "Then we wait properly this time," Della said, already organizing supplies with brisk efficiency. "No more roads, no more danger creeping up behind every tree. Just waiting, the way it should have been from the start." That evening, with Aster settled and resting peacefully, Roderick found Sparrow on a small balcony overlooking the castle gardens, the last light of day settling gold and quiet over grounds she hadn't yet learned to name. "Second-guessing the decision to stay?" he asked, settling beside her. "Not even slightly, just taking it in. 3 months ago I was stitching soldiers in a supply tent, certain my whole life would look exactly the same for the next 20 years. Now I'm standing on a castle balcony next to a king, waiting for a litter of royal wolf pups to arrive any day now. She glanced at him, something wry and warm in her expression. It's a considerable adjustment. A good one, I hope. The best one I've had in longer than I can remember. She leaned into him, watching the garden settle into evening shadow. Whatever comes next, the pups, the castle, all of it. I'm glad I get to face it here, instead of anywhere else. So am I, Roderick said quietly, pressing a kiss to her temple. More than I know how to properly say. Below them, from the open window of the den, Aster let out a long, contented sigh, settling deeper into her blankets. Patient, finally, for the last few days of waiting before everything changed completely. The days waiting for Aster's time stretched long and strange, full of a particular nervous tenderness Sparrow hadn't quite prepared herself for. The whole castle, it seemed, holding its breath alongside them. You'd think she was carrying the crown's entire treasury, Fitch observed, arriving at Winmere 3 days after them with the last of the disbanding campaign's supplies, taking in the sight of no fewer than 4 servants hovering anxiously near the den entrance. Extra blankets, warm broth on standby, someone assigned specifically to fetch the healer at any hour. I've seen queens receive less attentive care. She's earned it, Della said, not looking up from the basket of clean linen she was, for the 3rd time that day, meticulously reorganizing. After everything that creature's survived this past season, she'll be waited on like actual royalty, and anyone who disagrees can take it up with me personally. I wasn't disagreeing, merely observing. Your observations have a way of sounding like disagreements, old man. Fitch, wisely, declined to press the point further, settling instead beside Sparrow with his usual cup of something suspicious, watching Aster pace the length of her den with restless, uncomfortable energy. "How's she seem to you?" he asked, more gently than his teasing suggested. "Close. Very close." Sparrow ran a practiced hand along the wolf's swollen belly, feeling the particular tension that Marin had once described to her as the body quietly preparing itself, days before anything visible began. "Maybe tonight, tomorrow at the latest." "And how are you?" Sparrow considered the question longer than she expected to need. "Nervous, hopeful, a little disbelieving that we actually made it here, after everything. The Blade, Elias, Marsh, all of it, to something this ordinary and good. Ordinary's a fine thing to arrive at after a season like the one we've had." Fitch's weathered face had gone unexpectedly soft. "You did good work getting us here, girl. All of us. But you especially." Roderick found her an hour later in the small garden adjoining the healer's wing, sitting quietly among beds of late summer flowers she still hadn't learned all the names for, turning over the events of the past months with the particular restlessness of someone waiting for something too important to properly sit still for. "You've gone quiet," he said, settling beside her. "Just thinking. About everything that had to happen, exactly the way it did, for us to end up here. If I hadn't wandered past the grain tents that first night, if Marsh's plot had succeeded instead of failing, if Voss really had been the villain we suspected, instead of simply an ambitious man with an uncomfortable manner." She glanced at him. "It feels strange, how much depended on small, ordinary choices, rather than anything grand or fated." "I've had similar thoughts myself." Roderick took her hand, turning it over gently to examine the small scar on her palm, from an early, careless moment tending Aster's first wound. "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing her entirely, that first night, before I even knew your name, and how much of everything good that's happened since started with you simply choosing not to mind your own business. Fitch says that's my worst quality. Fitch is wrong. It's your best one, dressed up as a flaw because you're too modest to claim it properly." He kissed her knuckles gently, something warm and certain in the gesture. "Whatever happens tonight, however long we still have to wait, I'm grateful for every ordinary choice that led here." It was well past midnight when Della's urgent knock finally came, her usual brisk composure entirely abandoned in favor of genuine, contained excitement. "It's time," she said. She started properly now, no mistaking it this time. The den, when they reached it, held a particular hushed tension, Aster pacing in tight, careful circles, clearly deep in the early stages of labor, her sides working with the familiar rhythm Sparrow recognized from every difficult delivery she'd assisted over the years, human and animal alike. "Easy," Sparrow murmured, kneeling beside her, feeling the wolf lean gratefully into her steady presence. "I'm right here. We're all right here." Roderick knelt on Aster's other side, one hand resting gently on her flank, the same protective instinct that had first driven him cloakless across an entire kingdom now settled into quiet, steady patience. "Whatever happens tonight," he said softly, echoing words Sparrow remembered from another difficult night weeks earlier, "we're both right here for it. All of it together." What followed was, by any fair account, a long and careful night. Della's practiced hands guiding the process with the calm competence of someone who had clearly done this many times before for many different creatures. Fitch hovering anxiously near the entrance despite his usual claims of unshakable composure, and Sparrow herself staying close through every hour, offering steady hands and quiet reassurance whenever Aster's exhausted whimpers suggested she needed it. There was worry, certainly, the particular tension of waiting for new life to safely arrive after everything that had threatened it along the way. But none of the acute danger that had marked so much of the season before it. Only the ordinary, exhausting, entirely worthwhile work of a mother finally, safely bringing her litter into the world, surrounded by people who genuinely cared whether she managed it well. By the time the first gray hint of dawn touched the garden windows, 4 small, healthy pups lay nursing contentedly against Aster's side, and the wolf herself, exhausted but deeply peaceful, rested her great head against Sparrow's offered palm with a long, satisfied sigh that needed no translation at all. "4," Fitch said, finally allowed back into the den, his usual gruffness entirely abandoned in favor of open, unguarded delight. 4 healthy pups. After everything that tried to stop it from happening. I'd call that a fitting end to quite a season. "A fitting beginning," Roderick said quietly, watching the pups nurse with an expression Sparrow suspected she'd remember for the rest of her life. The particular, complete peace of a man who had finally, fully kept a promise made to his mother's memory years before he'd had any real understanding of what that promise might eventually cost or reward. The following days settled into a gentle, exhausted routine. Della fussing over Aster's recovery with the fierce devotion of someone who'd clearly grown attached over her weeks of anxious preparation. Fitch inventing increasingly elaborate names for each pup before Roderick gently overruled every single suggestion, and the whole castle, it seemed, finding small excuses to visit the den and witness the new arrivals for themselves. "You cannot name a royal pup Gravy," Roderick said, for what was clearly not the first time that week. "It's an excellent name, strong, memorable. It's the name of something you'd pour over a roast, Fitch. Precisely why it would never be forgotten." Fitch, entirely unbothered by the repeated rejection, continued cheerfully proposing names throughout the week, none of which were adopted, though Sparrow suspected he enjoyed the process of proposing them considerably more than he'd have enjoyed actually winning. Word arrived, near the end of that first week, that Captain Marsh had begun his labor in the Northern Territories, with what his overseers described as surprising, almost desperate diligence, a man clearly trying, in whatever limited way remained available to him, to rebuild something honest from the wreckage of his own choices. Elias, meanwhile, had settled into his new post in the castle's healing corps with visible relief, his sister's illness finally receiving proper treatment, and had taken, according to Della's amused reports, to following Sparrow around with the particular devoted attentiveness of someone determined to prove his gratitude through sheer diligent effort. General Voss sent formal word of his transfer to advisory duties, along with an unexpectedly warm personal note thanking Sparrow again for her fairness during a difficult season and expressing hope that he might visit Windmere properly sometime, if only to meet the pups whose safe arrival had cost so much careful effort to secure. "Everyone's rebuilding something," Sparrow observed one evening, watching Roderick read through the latest round of correspondence with visible satisfaction. Marsh with his labor, Elias with his new post, even Voss with his advisory work. It feels like the whole campaign's aftermath is people quietly trying to become better versions of themselves. "I'd like to think that's what good leadership actually accomplishes, when it's done properly," Roderick said. "Not simply punishing wrongdoing, but creating space for people to actually change afterward, rather than just carrying their worst moment forward indefinitely. You've become considerably more thoughtful about leadership since that first muddy night in the grain tent. I've had a remarkably persuasive teacher." He set the correspondence aside, reaching for her hand instead. "Speaking of which, I believe I still owe you a proper conversation about the future. One I've been building toward rather slowly these past weeks." He asked her properly the following morning, over breakfast rather than any grand ceremony, in a manner she would later insist was the most romantic possible choice, precisely because it wasn't trying to be anything at all. "I want you here," he said simply. Astor's 4 pups tumbling clumsily across the floor nearby while their mother watched with weary, affectionate patience. "Not because you saved her, though you did, more than once. And not because duty or gratitude demands it. Because I've come to care for you more than I've cared for anything in longer than I can properly remember. And I'd like the rest of my life to include you plainly, however that life ends up shaped. That's a great deal of sincerity before I've even finished my tea. I contain multitudes. Apparently that's contagious, spending enough time around you." Sparrow laughed, set down her cup, and said yes, plainly, without hesitation, the way she'd learned, over one long, difficult, ultimately worthwhile campaign, to say the true things out loud rather than let them go unspoken. Epilogue. 2 years later, Windmere's gardens had grown lush and familiar under Sparrow's careful attention, the small healing wing she'd built alongside Della, now training a handful of young apprentices in the art of patient, honest care. The same kind she'd once offered a wounded, frightened wolf in a grain tent, expecting nothing at all in return. Astor's 4 pups had grown into strong, distinct young wolves, each carrying some echo of their mother's watchful, steady nature. One bold and curious, always first to investigate anything new. One quiet and careful, content to observe before acting. And 2 who had, to Fitch's endless delight, developed his exact habit of appearing wherever food was being prepared, looking deeply wounded whenever turned away. Fitch himself remained exactly as gruffly essential as he'd always been, having long since abandoned any pretense of retiring, now training the castle's newest guards in the particular blend of vigilance and dry humor that had carried them all safely through one difficult season. Elias had risen, through steady diligence, to a respected position within the healing corps. His sister fully recovered and often visiting Windmere's gardens herself. The 2 of them frequently found sharing quiet laughter with Sparrow over tea. General Voss visited occasionally, true to his word, bringing his own children along to meet the now-grown wolves with genuine, uncomplicated delight. A man who had, in the years since, become something closer to a trusted friend than the cautious suspect he'd once seemed. And Sparrow herself, standing one autumn evening in the garden with Roderick's hand in hers, watching Astor doze contentedly in a patch of fading sunlight while her pups tumbled through fallen leaves nearby, understood at last what she had spent so many uncertain years believing she might never fully have. Not just safety, though there was certainly that. Not just love, though there was plenty of that too. She had finally a home that had chosen her back, built not from fate or destiny, but from small, ordinary choices, made honestly, one after another, until they'd become something worth calling a life. If this story found its way into your heart, the grain tent, the false trail through the fog, the long, quiet night the pups finally arrived, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. And if you're hungry for another tale of stubborn kindness and wolves worth saving, just say the word.